Snaking through the centre of Melbourne, wrapping around the southwest corner of our CBD, is this, the Flinders Street Viaduct, arguably the most important piece of rail infrastructure in the entire state. It connects our two biggest and busiest stations, Southern Cross and Flinders Street, and right now in 2024 is the only direct connection between the eastern and western halves of the entire state railway network. Despite the singular name, the viaduct is actually made up of several parallel viaducts opened at different times between 1891 and 1978, and today carries 6 tracks. In this video, we're going to take a look at how this elevated structure has evolved over the years, how it operates today, and why the older part is so wiggly. Prior to the viaduct's construction, the only connection between Flinders Street and Spencer Street had been a very basic single-track ground-level line built in 1879, which operated under tramway conditions. It was only allowed to be used late at night at a maximum speed of 4 miles per hour and was only for goods traffic. The first part of the viaduct was completed in 1891. It was double track and is the northernmost part of the viaduct we know today. It was, and still is, a very interesting structure featuring several different styles of construction. I'll go into more detail on that a bit later on. Initially it was used by goods trains only, but steam-hauled suburban passenger trains on the Williamstown and Essendon lines were running over the viaduct into Flinders Street by the end of 1894. This first stage of the viaduct was built in conjunction with the new Melbourne fish market, with the railway curving neatly between the buildings, and early on there was also a ground-level siding running from Spencer Street into the market. At the eastern end, the viaduct then curved around to the north to avoid Queen's Wharf, which was a busy goods and passenger wharf and the furthest point that large ships could navigate up the Yarra. The wharf was built into the northern bank of the river, forming a large open area of water, allowing space for these ships to be turned. This quite remarkable photo shows Queen's Wharf before the construction of the viaduct. It's undated, but 2 of the ships in view were built in 1877, and there's no sign of the tramway, which was built in 1879, so it's presumably within that 2-year window. Also, you can see a footbridge over the Port Melbourne line in the distance. Today, the turning basin has been mostly filled in, but that wiggle in the viaduct still clearly marks where it once was, and you can still make out the basic shape of the wharves. I was going to say that this area of water here is the last surviving part of the turning basin. However, this 1950s photo shows it filled in and being used as a car park, so it was obviously dug out again sometime after that. The second pair of viaduct tracks were added in 1915 in preparation for the electrification of the suburban network and all the extra traffic that would bring, and the extension followed the profile of the original double-track viaduct, widening it to the south. This created 2 pairs of through lines with left-hand running. The viaduct would remain in this form for the next 6 decades, however the area surrounding it changed dramatically during that time. Sadly, the fish market building was demolished in 1959, arguably one of the most significant historic buildings lost to this city, and was replaced by everyone's favourite 1950s thing, a low-density car park. What truly excellent use of inner-city land. At the same time, part of Flinders Street was raised up to pass over King Street on a flyover, and this is how the area looked when I started regularly visiting the city as a teenager. The next big change to the viaduct came in the late 70s when a 3rd pair of tracks were added as part of a major reconfiguration of the network for the impending opening of the underground city loop. With the turning basin now filled in, this new viaduct was able to take a much straighter route, running immediately along the riverbank. This new viaduct was open for traffic in 1978 and was built to a modern concrete design, clearly standing out from the older parts of the viaduct to the north. By the way, for the rest of the video, I'm going to refer broadly to the 1978 bit as the new viaduct, and the 1891/1915 bits collectively as the old viaduct. As part of the city loop opening, the suburban network was broadly divided into 4 groups of lines, 1 for each of the 4 new single-track tunnels making up the loop. The existing 4 viaduct tracks, which, as I mentioned earlier, had been 2 lots of left-hand running double track, were re-signalled for fully bidirectional operation, with each of the 4 tracks matching one of the 4 city loop tunnels. So from north to south, they carried the Clifton Hill group, the Burnley group, the Northern group, and the Caulfield group. And the bidirectional signalling allowed the direction of travel for each of these lines to change halfway through the day, in line with the loop's rather unusual operating pattern. Meanwhile, the new viaduct carried what was, and still is, known as the through lines, being regular left-hand running double track. The through lines, as you might guess from the name, were predominantly for through traffic not using the city loop, which in the 80s consisted of some suburban trains, but also country trains on the Gippsland line and freight trains. However, there was nothing stopping through traffic using the older viaduct tracks as well, and it was normal to see country trains on the old viaduct into the early 2010s. Another major visual change came in the year 2000 when the Melbourne Aquarium was built under and around the new viaduct. It's kind of hard to judge its scale from the outside, but the aquarium has 3 levels, one below ground, and is home to many, many thousands of aquatic creatures. In 2008, it was extended underneath the Old Viaduct as well, crucially adding penguins to the list of residents. Originally, the aquarium had this really cool whale mural overlooking the through lines, which looked great and was great advertising for the aquarium, but by early 2009 it had been painted over in plain blue, which remains the case to this day. That was around the same time as the aquarium was rebranded as Sea Life in capital letters except for the I, Melbourne Aquarium. And I'm personally surprised they've never taken the opportunity to paint themselves a new big advertisement here, with a massive captive audience rolling past every day. Honestly, I think some people just see the rail environment as purely industrial and don't consider that trains are, in fact, full of people. I guess on the flip side, when you're rolling over the top on a train, it's easy to forget that you're passing over all this. In 2005, the King Street overpass was demolished, and in late 2007, the car park on the former market site was turned into something actually useful, 3 large apartment buildings. Many of the apartments have balconies, well suited for watching trains from above, and I assume this is the main selling point. But some of the lower levels are treated to a really close relationship with the railway indeed. This shot, as well as several others in this video, is brought to you by fellow transport YouTuber Railford, who bravely spent a night in this closet-sized room in order to capture this footage.
I regret doing this.
Today, in 2024, the viaduct operates basically as it has done since the 1980s. However, there have been some small changes. While the 4 old viaduct tracks are still bidirectional, only 2 of the groups now reverse direction on a regular basis. The Clifton Hill group now runs clockwise full-time, with the Caulfield group running anti-clockwise. Meanwhile, the Werribee, Williamstown and Frankston lines have been removed from the loop to form the Cross City group, which operates over the through viaduct full-time. Things will change a bit more with the opening of the Metro Tunnel in 2025, with the Sandringham line taking over the eastern part of the Cross City group, and the Frankston line taking over the Caulfield loop. There are lots of crossovers between the Flinders Street platforms and the viaduct, and again at the western end before Southern Cross, so while each group of lines usually sticks to their own track over the viaduct, there are plenty of alternative routings possible. For instance, a Clifton Hill group train can run via the Burnley Viaduct and still get back across to the correct platform at Southern Cross, and every group has at least one alternate option like that. There are, however, some restrictions on what types of trains can operate over the old viaduct, and it's basically electric suburban trains only under normal circumstances, with all locomotive hauled trains required to use the new viaduct. There are some exceptions to this, the most common one being for EVI, the Infrastructure Evaluation Train, which conveniently rocked up to demonstrate this while I was there getting footage for this video. I believe the reason for the restriction on locomotives is to reduce the span loading on this bit above the Spencer and Flinders Street intersection, which is partly cantilevered. See how there's a support on this side, but this side just floats magically above the road? Although it was allowed in the past, so it might also just be to reduce axle loads on the older structure overall. As a result of this restriction, you will normally only ever see freight trains on the new viaduct, and that also means you'll only ever see them passing through Flinders Street on platform 7 or above, as there's no access to the lower numbered platforms from the through lines. There are several daily freight trains through here, which most of the time manage to coexist quite happily with the frequent suburban trains on the Cross City group. You know I like a good place to watch trams and trains in the same scene, and the viaduct is certainly one of the best places in Melbourne for that. Tram routes 70, 75 and the City Circle run parallel to the viaduct along Flinders Street, passing underneath it at the western end, and routes 12, 96 and 109 pass underneath on Spencer Street. Route 58 also passes underneath near the eastern end on Queensbridge and Market Streets. Okay, so let's take a bit of a closer look at the actual structure of the old viaduct. The original double-track part, built in 1891, was interestingly made up of 3 distinct sections. The eastern part at the Flinders Street end had a riveted steel deck supported on brick pillars. Then, and there aren't many pictures showing it, but the part on the curve running through the market buildings was actually made up of brick arches. You can see it clearly in this photo taken while the market was still under construction. At the time this photo was taken, only one of the 2 tracks was complete and available for use. You can see that train is heading east on what would become the westbound track. This was also before regular passenger trains started running, so that must be some kind of special. At least some of the arches were walled off to create space for market businesses underneath. If you look really carefully, you can see a white cross over a black square at the end of the brick section. And if we look at this slightly later picture, you can see there are actually 2 of them. While a lot of changes have happened to this structure over the past 13 decades, that section of brickwork is actually still intact and easily visible today at the corner of Flinders and Spencer Streets. The final section of curve over Flinders Street had longer spans with larger steel girders on large bluestone pillars. When the viaduct was expanded to 4 tracks in 1915, it seems a lot of care was taken to visually match the style of the original structure. You can see here that before quadruplication, the double-track deck was supported by rows of 3 brick columns. Note the bluestone base, this white cross pattern in the brick, this white line near the top, and the way the steel structure is supported. Here's what they look like today, and we can see those are certainly the same columns. However, 2 more were added on each row on the southern side for the 1915 expansion, and they match the style exactly to those built 2.5 decades earlier. The middle column today is in between the 2 decks, and the gap between it and this column is slightly wider than the next gap, showing that the original 1891 supports were built slightly asymmetrically to allow the future expansion, which they must have had in mind from the start. And you can see that asymmetry in the early photos too. Another thing about those white brick patterns, the ones on the east and west side of the columns are all this simple cross design, while the north and south sides have this slightly more elaborate pattern. And again, this is identical on the 1891 and 1915 columns. I'm not sure if the different patterns symbolise anything, or if they're purely decorative. When the 1915 part opened for traffic, the 1891 side was closed for some major strengthening and modification. You can see that happening in this picture. And it wasn't until 1917 that all 4 tracks were actually in use simultaneously. During this time, some rows of columns were replaced by full-width brick supports, which still maintain a similar aesthetic. Another curiosity is that for the far eastern part of the viaduct, the rows of columns are at 90 degrees to the deck, as you might expect. But then about halfway along this straight section, they change to be at an angle. This roughly matches the angle of part of the former Queen's Wharf, and I assume it was done like that to allow for the roadway connecting the wharves and market area to Flinders Street. There's also this one column that obviously had some kind of oopsie. At some point, the brick arch section through the market was removed. I'm fairly certain that was done as part of the quadruplication. A new deck was built with steel girders supported on solid brick walls, but to this day you can still see the bluestone trimming where the bases of the arches were. In fact, it's on these structures where you can see some of the only obvious visual evidence of the double-track era. You can see this bluestone footing is only 2 tracks wide, and this is the bit that would have led up to the start of the arch. Then you can see all the rest of the brick is a slightly different colour, showing where it was widened and the top part replaced. Something else you might have noticed while staring at this is that the deck here doesn't look very old at all, and that's because it isn't. The entire deck between Spencer Street and the other side of the aquarium was replaced with a brand new concrete deck on steel I-beam in the year 2000. This is the same section that originally had the brick arches, so the deck that replaced them must have had some issues. One thing I noticed while walking around underneath is that the sound of the trains is much louder on this 21st century deck compared to the older riveted sections. And yeah, that's the bit that goes right past the apartments. The new deck doesn't immediately leap out as looking modern from the side, and that's largely because it's fitted with this ornate handrail, which I assumed was faithfully refurbished and relocated from the old deck. Here it is looking very fresh and clean in 2005. However, here's a Western Langford image showing that section in 1962. That's not our handrail. Here it is again in 1977. It's not there either. From what I can tell, the ornate handrail never existed on that middle section of viaduct that was originally brick arches, and what we see today is a brand new handrail built for the new deck in 2000, matching the style of the original one on other parts of the viaduct. Kind of a strange historical quirk, but it certainly improves the appearance of the otherwise quite charmless new deck. The area immediately to the east of the viaduct might appear to be supported entirely on filled earth, but it's actually built on top of a series of brick vaults, which run the full length between Flinders Street and the bank of the Yarra. These were originally known as the viaduct vaults and were built by the railways as part of the initial viaduct construction, with the aim of collecting some extra revenue by renting them out to businesses. They quickly became known as the Banana Alley Vaults, as apparently bananas were stored here after arriving from the tropics and being unloaded at Queen's Wharf. Banana Alley is still used by various businesses today, mostly ones I've never quite felt the need to visit. There's a gym, a nightclub, a fight club, and the office for Melbourne river cruises. You can also visit this barber and exchange your hair for some free whiskey. When I was browsing the State Library of Victoria site for historic images, I came across a couple of very interesting artists' impressions of the viaduct from before its construction. This one from 1879 shows an entirely different style of bridge, but the location, looking west down Flinders Street with Queen's Wharf under the bridge to the left, is still very recognisable. However, it's this one I find really interesting. It's from 1889 when construction, I think, was already underway. The viaduct is shown much higher up, almost fantastically so, but the actual structure is quite accurate to what was actually built. You can see the distinct sections with the brick arches in the middle and the section of angled columns leading towards the wharf. There are also some reasonably accurate looking cable trams trundling up and down the road. One final thing, as most of you will know, here in Victoria we have a very intensive program of heritage trains running on the mainline network, and the viaduct is one of a fairly small number of places worldwide where you can regularly see steam trains running past a backdrop of modern skyscrapers. It's also become a uniquely Melbourne tradition for the drivers to put on a bit of a whistle show here, especially when returning from a trip at night. I've watched this from South Bank many times, and it never gets old. If you'd like to listen to the whole thing, I'll put a link to that footage down below. So, the Flinders Street Viaduct has seen a huge amount of change since it was first built in 1891, and there's plenty of that history still plainly visible today in the viaduct's meandering route and structural variations. If you get a chance, I highly recommend going for a walk underneath the Old Viaduct. There's loads of historic details, and maybe you'll spot something I missed. Thanks very much for watching.